Before you dive in, brace yourself for a story of deception, betrayal, and power like no other. Follow Leila Marquez, a brilliant forensic accountant, as she uncovers a web of lies that threatens not just her life, but the lives of everyone around her. Will she rise from the shadows of betrayal to seize control, or will the criminal underworld claim her first? Stay with us. This is a thrilling ride you won't want to miss. Leila Marquez had always trusted numbers more than people. Ledgers, spreadsheets, and financial flows were predictable, logical, and transparent. People, however, were not. And she had just discovered that the man she had married, Thomas Herrera, was far from the man she thought she knew. It started subtly. A misdirected phone call, an unusual withdrawal, a transfer she couldn't reconcile. At first, she assumed mistakes, clerical errors, or maybe even a lapse in judgment. But forensic accounting had trained her to dig deeper, to follow the trail no matter how faint. And what she found shook her to the core. Thomas wasn't a legitimate businessman. He was a criminal cleaner, a man who moved money for cartels, hiding millions behind shell companies and offshore accounts. Every time she had smiled at him, laughed with him, and believed in their life together, she had been nothing more than an unwitting alibi in his schemes. She confronted him one evening, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "Thomas, what is all of this?" He laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You think you understand the world, Leila. You don't. You're just convenient." Convenient. That word echoed in her mind as she realized the depth of her betrayal. Thomas had siphoned $188 million without leaving a trace, using her presence, her credibility, her trust as a shield against suspicion. And now, the truth had come crashing down. Before she could react further, Thomas became violent. She tried to escape, but he cornered her, rage in his eyes, his hands leaving marks she would feel long after. It was clear she could not confront him alone, not with the stakes so high. She needed help, dangerous, calculated help. Enter Kim Sang-yun, a Korean mafia boss whose reputation preceded him. Known for his precision, ruthlessness, and strategic mind, he was feared by rivals and allies alike. Leila reached out to him, not knowing if he would see her as a pawn or as an asset. Their first meeting was tense. In a dimly lit warehouse, Leila stood across from Sang-yun, her heart pounding but her mind sharp. He observed her silently, his gaze assessing every detail, weighing the risk and the value. "You've been involved in something dangerous," Sang-yun said finally, his voice calm but commanding. "And you are either a liability or an opportunity." "I'm an opportunity," Leila replied, her voice unwavering. "I know Thomas's operations. I know where the money is, how it moves, and how to dismantle him. You want him stopped? I can help." Sang-yun studied her for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "Very well. But if you misstep, you won't survive the night." That was all the warning she needed. Survival depended on wit, precision, and control. Over the next days, Leila worked tirelessly, mapping Thomas's empire, decrypting financial data, and identifying weak points. She became a ghost in her own life, moving unseen, listening, analyzing, preparing. Every detail mattered. Every decision could be the difference between life and death. Thomas, meanwhile, remained oblivious to the storm building around him. He underestimated her, assuming fear and shock would render her compliant. But Leila had transformed her fear into strategy. She wasn't the victim he thought she was. She was the player, and he was about to discover how lethal intellect could be. The first coordinated strike came suddenly. Leila and Sang-yun created diversions, disrupting Thomas's network just enough to draw attention, while preserving the advantage of surprise. Through careful digital maneuvers, she accessed shell company accounts, traced suspicious transfers, and began unraveling the money flows that had made Thomas untouchable. For the first time in her life, Leila felt the exhilaration of control. Every calculation, every decrypted file, every predicted reaction brought her closer to the ultimate goal, not just survival, but dominance. She was no longer a pawn in Thomas's game. She was the strategist, the architect, and, eventually, the victor. The days blurred together, tension mounting with every intercepted transfer, every silent maneuver. Leela learned quickly that the criminal mind operated in patterns. Hubris, predictability, and overconfidence were its vulnerabilities. And she was ready to exploit them. The inevitable confrontation loomed. Thomas would soon realize that the web he had spun was unraveling, and when he did, he would act, and violently. Leela knew she had to be prepared, both mentally and physically. Sang Yoon's enforcers provided protection, but the true weapon was her intelligence, her ability to anticipate, plan, and strike with surgical precision. By the end of Part 1, Leela had transformed in ways Thomas could never predict. She had moved from shock and fear to calculated determination. Her alliance with Sang Yoon was fragile but potent, built on necessity, but strengthened by mutual respect. The chessboard was set, the pieces in position, and the first moves were about to begin. The real game was just starting. Leela Marquez moved through the city like a shadow, aware of every step, every reflection in the glassy windows lining the streets. Her apartment, once a sanctuary, had become a cage of memories. Memories of laughter, intimacy, and trust that Thomas Herrera had weaponized against her. Now, every photograph and memento reminded her of deception, manipulation, and danger. But Leela no longer dwelled in fear. Each beat of her heart pulsed with strategy, precision, and determination. Her first days, after reaching out to Kim Sang-yoon, had been tense. Sang-yoon, the Korean Mafia boss with a reputation for ruthless efficiency, had been skeptical of her value. But she quickly proved herself, providing critical insight into Thomas's vast laundering operation. He had watched her move with silent appraisal, noting her intellect, courage, and ability to anticipate moves that even seasoned criminals might overlook. "You understand the stakes, don't you?" Sang-yoon had asked during one of their early meetings in his sleek, dimly lit office. "I do," Leela replied, her tone calm but resolute. "I know where the money flows, how Thomas manipulates people, and where his vulnerabilities lie. I can dismantle him from within." Sang-yoon's eyes, sharp as blades, assessed her. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. "Very well. But this isn't a game. One mistake, and it's over." Leela had accepted that risk long ago. The alliance they formed was delicate but powerful. Sang-yoon provided the muscle, the enforcement, and the reach that Leela could never access on her own. Leela offered intelligence, insight, and control of the digital labyrinth Thomas had constructed. Together, they became a force Thomas couldn't anticipate. The first challenge was infiltration. Thomas had built layers of security around his operations. Encrypted networks, offshore accounts, and a chain of loyal operatives trained to detect anomalies. Leela spent nights poring over every digital footprint, every suspicious transfer, and every unusual financial pattern. Each discovery was another arrow in her quiver, each decrypted file another tool in the weapon she was forging. Through careful observation, she noticed a pattern in Thomas's movements: arrogance. He assumed she would be too terrified, too distracted, to act against him. He didn't consider the possibility that she could be precise, ruthless, and lethal in her own way. The first strike was subtle. Leela initiated a minor disruption in Thomas's network. A dummy transaction that drew attention without exposing her hand. At the same time, Sang-yoon positioned his operatives near key locations Thomas might target, ready to neutralize any threat before it reached her. That night, Leela returned to the apartment she had once shared with Thomas under the pretense of retrieving personal items. Each step was deliberate, each movement calculated. She avoided leaving traces, avoided emotional distraction, and focused entirely on strategy. The apartment was filled with remnants of a life she no longer belonged to. Photos, letters, objects once treasured. They now served as silent reminders of betrayal. Her phone buzzed with a message from Sang-yoon. Step 2 begins. Move carefully. With his guidance, Leela penetrated deeper into Thomas's financial network. She identified a backdoor overlooked due to his overconfidence and exploited it to access offshore accounts and shell company holdings. Each entry, each redirect, was precise. She siphoned data without triggering alarms, creating chaos in his empire while maintaining complete anonymity. Thomas was not oblivious. Somewhere, he sensed disruption. Something was wrong. Panic, uncharacteristic for a man of his discipline, crept into his thoughts. He deployed loyal operatives to investigate, unaware that the threat was not brute force but intellect. Leela had learned his patterns, predicted his contingencies, and prepared counters for every move. The tension escalated when Thomas finally recognized the scale of the intrusion. His anger and disbelief made him reckless. He underestimated Leela and Sang Yun, assuming intimidation and violence could solve what intellect had undone. But he had miscalculated. The confrontation was inevitable. Sang Yun and Leela orchestrated a meeting at an abandoned warehouse. An environment controlled, yet threatening. Thomas arrived with a contingent of loyal muscle, expecting a fight of strength and aggression. He did not expect precision, strategy, and a carefully laid trap. "You think you can take me down?" Thomas sneered, attempting to mask his unease. "I built this empire. You're nothing." Leela's gaze was steady, icy. "This isn't about thinking, it's about knowing. And I know you've already lost." The Sangyun emerged from the shadows, calm, lethal, and imposing. "It ends tonight, Thomas. Your empire of lies ends tonight." The warehouse erupted into controlled chaos. Gunfire ricocheted off concrete walls, shadows danced under the dim lights, and every move Thomas made had been anticipated. Leela directed operations, her intellect turning digital warfare into a tangible advantage on the ground. Sang Yun's enforcers neutralized physical threats with precision. Every trap Thomas had laid backfired. Every plan he had counted on collapsed. In a few decisive moves, he was isolated, exposed, and finally defeated. The man who had once manipulated her life now lay powerless, his network crumbling into ruin. After the confrontation, Leela and Sangyun stood amidst the wreckage, the silence punctuated only by distant city sounds. Leela's hands were steady, her mind sharp. She had survived violence, outmaneuvered betrayal, and claimed control over what had once threatened her. "You've changed everything?" Sangyun said, his voice acknowledging her brilliance and resilience. "Yes," Leela replied, eyes scanning the horizon as city lights reflected off glass towers. "And now, it's our turn." The alliance between Leela Marquez and Kim Sangyun had solidified. No longer just a partnership of necessity, it had evolved into one of respect, shared strategy, and lethal efficiency. Together, they had outmaneuvered a man who had seemed untouchable and dismantled a web of criminal deception that spanned continents. For Leela, the transformation was complete. From a woman betrayed, injured, and hunted, she had become a strategist, a manipulator of financial and criminal networks, and a formidable power player. She had learned that intelligence, courage, and precision were more dangerous than brute force, and that fear could be weaponized into mastery. But she knew this was not the end. Other threats lurked in the shadows, rival cartels, former associates of Thomas, and those who had lost fortunes in the chaos he left behind. Leela and Sangyun would need to anticipate, adapt, and act again. The game was far from over, but now, they were no longer pawns. They were the players. And the players always dictated the rules. The city stretched below them like a glittering puzzle of light and shadow, oblivious to the storm that had just passed. Leela Marquez stood on the rooftop of a high-rise, wind tugging at her hair, her gaze fixed on the streets far below. The chaos of Thomas Herrera's empire had subsided, his network of deceit dismantled with precision and lethal efficiency. But Leela knew better than to believe the threat was over. In her world, peace was fragile and power was never given. It was seized and defended with vigilance. Over the past weeks, Leela and Kim Sangyun had consolidated their gains. Thomas's former allies had been neutralized, either through exposure, negotiation, or elimination. Shell companies had been dismantled or absorbed, accounts redirected under their control. The cartels that once relied on Thomas's cleaning services were wary, cautious, and uncertain who now held the true leverage. Leela's knowledge of financial flows, digital footprints, and hidden vulnerabilities had transformed her from victim to strategist, from hunted to predator. Yet the journey had been more than tactical. It had been deeply personal. Every ledger she had decrypted, every digital backdoor she had exploited, was a reminder of betrayal, but also of her resilience. Lila Marquez no longer feared the shadows. She thrived in them, using intellect, courage, and calculation to turn danger into advantage. The first major challenge post-Thomas came unexpectedly. One of his former lieutenants, desperate to reclaim lost power, coordinated a hit on Lila, seeking to exploit what they assumed was a temporary alliance with Sang Yun. Lila intercepted communications, traced financial transactions, and anticipated their movements. She and Sang Yun orchestrated a trap, a carefully controlled confrontation in an abandoned warehouse district. The night was thick with tension as they approached the location. Lila's fingers flew over her laptop, manipulating digital surveillance, redirecting funds, and predicting enemy movements. Sang Yun's operatives, lethal and silent, moved in the shadows, prepared for every contingency. When the ambush occurred, the attackers were met with an almost invisible web of strategy, entry points blocked, communications jammed, and escape routes cut off. Within moments, the would-be assassins were neutralized. No mistakes, no hesitation, just precise, calculated execution. "You're remarkable," Sang Yun said afterward, his tone quiet but filled with respect. "Most people would have panicked." "I don't panic," Lila replied, her voice steady. "I calculate." That calculation became their signature. Lila and Sang Yun moved through the city like ghosts, dismantling threats before they could manifest, redirecting funds, consolidating power, and establishing dominance. The alliance was no longer one of necessity. It was a partnership of equals. Lila's intellect and Sang Yun's enforcement formed a formidable combination that left rivals wary and allies respectful. Days blurred into nights as their influence expanded. Lila oversaw finances, digital operations, and strategy, while Sang Yun handled enforcement and external negotiations. They became a force impossible to challenge without catastrophic risk. Lila had transformed not only in power but in confidence. The woman Li had once trusted blindly now trusted only in her own skills, instincts, and judgment, and in Sang Yun, who had proven an equal partner. But Lila's transformation was not solely external. Emotionally, she had shed the fear, vulnerability, and self-doubt that had once defined her. Every move, every decision, every victory reinforced her autonomy. She was no longer a pawn or a victim. She was the architect of her destiny. Her intelligence, courage, and foresight ensured she would never again be manipulated, underestimated, or controlled. One evening, atop the skyscraper where they often met, Lila and Sang Yun surveyed the city. Below, neon lights shimmered across streets wet with rain, reflections dancing in puddles. The hum of life continued, indifferent to the battles that had reshaped power behind the scenes. "Do you ever wonder what comes next?" Lila asked, her eyes scanning the horizon. Sang Yun exhaled slowly, a rare moment of contemplation. "Every day. But it doesn't matter. We shape what comes next. We define it." Lila nodded. "Then we define it wisely." The partnership they had forged was more than strategy. It was symbiosis. Lila's intellect